Hey everyone, it's Argonath here from The Right Way, and I came across this article about the media narrative which is driving news in the US, especially from many of the not right wing, the left wing mainstream media outlets. And this is also a good wake up call for us here in New Zealand, because most of our mainstream media is also left leaning and highly uncritical of the current government, because they are a left-wing government. So let's have a read of this article, because there's a lot of points which are suitable for New Zealand as well. So the heading is "When All the Media Narratives Collapse" from Andrew Sullivan. In case after case, the US mainstream media just keeps getting it wrong, or is flat out lying, in my opinion. But let's have a look. The news is a perilous business. It's perilous because the first draft of history is almost always somewhat wrong and needs a second draft and a third, and so on over time, until the historian can investigate with more perspective and calm. The job of journalists is to do the best they can day by day and respond swiftly when they screw up, correct the record and move forward. I've learnt this the hard way, not least in the combination of credulousness and trauma I harboured in the wake of 9/11. But when the sources of news keep getting things wrong and all the errors lie in the exact same direction, and they are reluctant to acknowledge the error, we have a problem. If you look back at the last few years, the record of errors, small and large, about major stories is hard to deny. It's as if the more Donald Trump accused the mainstream media of being fake news, the more assiduously they tried to prove him right. That was absolutely correct. I don't know, whatever you think of Donald Trump, the mainstream media always spun things to be in his negative. And we see this quite a lot with all mainstream media here in New Zealand and overseas. They report something. If they get something wrong, or it's a little bit undecided about what they're saying is true or not, there's never a correction later on, right? They never want to admit that they're wrong, because they want to keep on with their ideology. And these mass deceptions have consequences. We are seeing this now in the Rittenhouse case. A gruesome story of a reckless teen with a rifle in the wake of a police shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha. The impression many got from the media was that the far-right vigilante in the middle of race riots had gone looking for trouble far from home, injured one man and killed two in a shooting spree. Here's the New York Times on the August 26th, the morning after the killings. The authorities were investigating whether the white teenager who was arrested was part of a vigilante group. His social media accounts appeared to show an intense affinity for guns, law enforcement, and President Trump. Rittenhouse's race is specified. The race of the men he killed and injured were not, because they were also white, but they don't want to spoil their narrative that white people are killing black people. So they just conveniently leave off the fact that the person that he killed and injured were also white. Then everyone is going to assume that the people he killed and injured were black. And that's what a lot of people actually thought, and that was never really trumpeted in the mainstream media in the US. Almost immediately, the complicated facts become unimportant. The far right viewed Rittenhouse as a hero, which he surely wasn't. He had no business being there with an AR-15. The MSM and the far left viewed him as a villain, appalled that he was being elevated as a symbol of self-defense. Well, looking at the trial that's just completed, I think it's a textbook case of self-defense, in my uneducated opinion. But I guess we'll find out once the verdict comes through. Painting Rittenhouse as a MAGA fanatic. Did note at the very bottom of the page, supporters of Mr. Rittenhouse said he was being attacked by the mob and acted in legitimate self-defense. So they did have a caveat, but again, it was a very thing I note at the very bottom of the page, because I know most people never get to the end of an article, right? You've probably done that yourself. So this is another thing about how they form the narrative. They put something which leads to the truth near the very end of the article, so that they can say, hey, we did mention this. It's at the very end, because they know that most people never get to the end of an article. But notice how the narrative, embedded in a deeper one than the Blake shooting, was just as clear-cut as the Floyd murder. That thousands of black men were being gunned down by cops every year, and that white supremacy was rampant in every cranny of America, effectively excluding the possibility that Rittenhouse was a naive, dangerous fool in the midst of indefensible mayhem, who in the end shot assailants in self-defense. And so when this week one of Rittenhouse's pursuers, Gay's Grosskreutz, admitted on the stand that Rittenhouse shot him only after Grosskreutz pointed a pistol directly at Rittenhouse's head a few feet away. It came as a shock to many people because they believe the mainstream media. Never take anything the mainstream media says. Always take it with a grain of salt, or always just think that they're spinning a narrative, they're spinning the truth, because that's what they always do, and we see that so many times here in New Zealand as well. Money quote from the defence lawyer: "It wasn't until you pointed your gun at him, advanced on him with your gun and your hands down, pointed at him, that he fired, right?" To which Grosskreutz answered, "Correct." Here's how the NYT first described this a year ago on August 26. Video footage from the scene of the shooting appears to show Mr. Rittenhouse running and then firing his gun, striking a man in the head. He then flees and is chased by bystanders before tripping, falling to the ground and shooting another man. That is so far different to what the person on the stand, who was the prosecutor's witness, not the defense witness, actually testified in court. A day later, another New York Times piece, which I relied on at the time. Here's the account of the video footage they embedded. As Mr. Rittenhouse is running, he trips and falls to the ground. He fires 4 shots as 3 people rush towards him. One person appears to be hit in the chest and falls to the ground. Another, who is carrying a handgun, Grosskreutz, is hit in the arm and runs away. Any sense of self-defense there? And when you watch the full version of the same video on YouTube, you see that for some reason the NYT cut off the key moment showing Rittenhouse's self-defense, the moment that proves so critical in court. This is the other thing, right? They intentionally leave off evidence which disproves their narrative. So you can't take anything the mainstream media says as truth, as gospel. You have to look at things yourself. You have to look for other information, because generally they are misrepresenting the facts or leaving the facts out entirely, and just goes to show you what the New York Times did. They are a garbage publication. I haven't watched the whole trial, but if you watch any length of time, you realize you've been led to believe a media narrative that was way off. Independent journalists last year, like Jesse Singal, were more clear-eyed. Because of that narrative whiplash, we may have more rioting and violence if he's acquitted. The judge is already being targeted. I'm not defending Rittenhouse, and I understand news gathering is fallible, but there's a media pattern here, and it reaches far wider than the Rittenhouse. So this is the thing, right? All the media narrative that the mainstream media is spinning will get people angry, up in arms, because the decision might not go their way, that they've been lied to and misrepresented by the mainstream media, and that's going to cause lies. But the mainstream media don't care about that. All they care about is ratings. That's all they're going for. And of course, painting Rittenhouse as a right-wing thug who went out and intentionally shot people will get them a lot more ratings and clicks than saying different things. We found out this week, for example, that a key figure in the emergence of the Steele dossier, Igor Danchenko, had been indicted for lying to the FBI. He's also been charged with asking a Clinton crony, Charles Dolan Jr., "Any thought, rumor, allegation? I'm working on a related project against Trump." The evidence for another key source for the dossier, Sergey Milian, touted across all media, including the Washington Post, has also been exposed as potentially fake. What has the Post done? As their own indispensable Eric Wemple notes, instead of a clear retraction, the Post has just added editor notes to previous stories, removed sections and a video, and altered headlines retroactively. So of course no one's going to go looking at those original articles anymore to see what those changes have been made. They need to create a new article to retract what they did. This is a bizarre way of correcting the record. No such case comes immediately or specifically to mind, at least no historical case that stirred lasting controversy. Think of other narratives that the mainstream media pushed in recent years that have collapsed. They viciously defamed the Covington boys. They authoritatively told us that bounties had been placed on US soldiers in Afghanistan by Putin, and Trump's denials only made them more certain. They told us that the lab leak theory of COVID was a conspiracy theory with no evidence behind it at all. The New York Times actually had the story of the leak theory by Donald McNeil, killed it, and then fired McNeil, their best COVID reporter, after some schoolgirls complained he wasn't woke. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Exactly. The MSM took the ludicrous story of Jussie Smollett seriously because it fit their nutty white supremacy narrative. They told us that a woman was brutally gang raped at UVA, invented, that the Pulse mass shooting was driven by homophobia, which is untrue, and that the Atlanta Spa Pool shooter was motivated by anti-Asian bias. There was no evidence for that at all. For good measure, they followed up the story after story about white supremacists targeting Asian Americans in a new wave of hate, even as the assaults were disproportionately by African Americans and the mentally ill. This is what they do. Again, they leave off information that doesn't fit their narrative and they trumpet up the things which will fit their narrative, basically. If you remember the Jussie Smollett incident, basically he said that a bunch of MAGA people, Make America Great Again people, Trump supporters, jumped him and assaulted him, put a noose around his neck and so on, and then it was later proven that he paid a couple of black people, or I think was it Arab people, I can't remember exactly, but they weren't white. He paid these people to do it to him, and he made the whole thing up. But initially the mainstream media lapped it up and gave it so much news because it fit their narrative. And this is what's happening, right? More recently, the MSM were telling us for months that inflation is a phantasm. We were told that the 2021 inflation scare is another in a series of false alarms going back several decades. We were assured that the numbers of at least for now are on the side of those expecting the trend to subside and then stabilise at lower level. Any concern was fear-mongering politics, and now we wake up to the highest inflation in 30 years, counterbalancing wage increases. Still they tell us that all will be well. Exactly. So here in New Zealand, you will have noticed that our inflation has risen quite almost double than what we were expecting. So we're still going to have that narrative pushed on us as well. Just to finish up, I still rely on the MS7 for so much. I still read the New York Times first thing in the morning. I don't want to feel as if everything I read is basically tilted through wish fulfillment, narrative proving an ideology, but with this kind of record, how can I not? We need facts and objectivity more than ever. Trump showed that. What we got in the MSM was an overreaction, a reflexive overreach to make the news fit the broader political fight. This is humanly understandable, it's professionally unacceptable, and someone has got to stop it. Right? So again, salient point for New Zealand as well. Don't believe everything in the mainstream media, on the TV news, in the woke print media, stuff.co.nz, New Zealand Herald. Don't believe all of that stuff. You need to do your own research and look on it with your own common sense eyes. I thought this article was really good just to prove that point as well. It's happening in the US, happening in New Zealand, it's happening everywhere. And so we need to start looking more deeply at it. So hopefully it might give you pause for thought once you read more stories and watch the TV news and so on. Let me know what you think about the mainstream media here in New Zealand or in whichever country you're in. Do you believe what they say? Do you always take what they say with a grain of salt? Or do you think what this article is talking about is just rubbish? I'd love to hear your comments or read your comments. Please let me know in the comment section. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't like the video, you're welcome to give it a thumbs down. And hopefully I will catch you in the next video.